WNST, Taos in Baltimore, and WNST.net. It is the summer of our NFL discontent around here, especially with the Orioles stinking the joint up, so training camp come quick enough for us around here. And I'm visiting with a whole bunch of people to cover the National Football League all summer during what is known for the coaches and many of the players as the beach time and the downtime, but it's not beach time for this guy. He covers the NFL as well as many other things. And it's a great follow out on Twitter at the New York Times. We welcome him back on. Ken Belson joins us from New York. And, of course, you can follow him on Twitter at L Belson. That's EL_BLSON. It's his Hispanic name to keep things politically correct around here. What's going on, Ken? How are you, man?
Enjoying the sunshine and the not being in stadiums for a couple weeks anyway.
We'll get there soon enough. Unless we're on the U2 tour or the Eagles tour up there at Citi Field later on in the summer. Look, man, you cover the NFL, and as much as you cover the games between the lines and the strategy and all that, at the New York Times you are sort of charged with covering the political aspects of this, and there always are some, whether it's stadiums deals getting done or not getting done, and there's plenty of that going around with the NFL, and we know that story here for 4 decades in Baltimore, and the Redskins name thing, but the Colin Kaepernick thing has certainly bubbled to the top, and as much as there may be a faction of the Trumpers in the NFL community that want this to go away and say shame on him and he shouldn't play, I find this thing quite disturbing and very un-American, and I guess from, I saw you out at the league meetings back in Arizona a couple months ago, this thing's going to fester, and this thing isn't over with by any stretch of the imagination for Kaepernick not getting a job and really being blackballed this summer.
Well, I think if he were older, it would be different. You could argue if he was 35, that sure, he would have been passed over. He's only a few years removed from the Super Bowl. The other thing is, it's not like he committed a crime. He didn't go to jail for anything. He didn't commit a felony. He didn't beat didn't hurt a dog. A lot of other transgressions that other players have committed who have gotten big, lucrative contracts afterwards. So that makes this a very different scenario. This is more a PR story than a moral story, and I just think the owners, or some of the owners, or enough of the owners, are just not interested in the headache. But let's face it, I mean, the NFL, more than most leagues, is a patriotic league, or at least promotes itself as that. And with all the flyovers over stadiums and the football field-sized flags that are rolled out every Sunday.
Some of which, by the way, the government pays them to do, by the way, and that's been well documented as well.
Yes, there was that case that came up a couple of years ago where the U.S. Army and other branches of the military were paying to have their services promoted during games. The NFL has since stopped that, I'm told. But, yes, this is a league that very much likes to see itself as a very all-American league, even though baseball is probably a more American sport. And so, this is a very confusing time for the league, and I think the league office would like to keep their head down and hope this just goes away. My bet is that some team will pick him up at some point. Somebody's going to get injured. He will be the best quarterback still out there when, say, Teddy Bridgewater goes down, as he did last year. Some starting quarterback will go down, and a team will have a need suddenly. It didn't stop teams from looking at Michael Vick the same way, and teams want to make themselves better, and they'll hold their nose if they have to.
I'm in Baltimore, Ken, and as a media member and seeing what's happening to the media, and I know your organization as well, very much involved in this. Peter Angelos took my press pass 11 years ago, and at the time, I saw it for what it was, which is we're going to hang the Venezuelan kid, and no one will ever ask me a question again. No one will ever, and I have not seen anything negative written about Peter Angelos since I had my press pass taken away. I find it fascinating with the Kaepernick thing that I am sure, because I'm in these locker rooms as you are, given the color, given the politics, given the background of many of the players in the league, there are many, many people that feel similarly about how the government's going right now to Colin Kaepernick. This whole "you're not going to work anymore" really works as a nice little suppressant to anyone that would get out of line, to anyone that would speak out about anything politically, even though, our rights as Americans are there. Your rights as an NFL player is to sit down, shut up, and do what you're told, right?
Well, there is I don't think there is a coordinated campaign. I doubt we'll find a a memo from headquarters saying stay away from this guy. However, I think teams know what might tick off the majority of their fans. And frankly, some of these owners, in fact, I would say the majority of these owners, are very conservative to begin with. I've looked at the political donations across all 32 teams, and I counted somewhere, I believe the number was 7 registered Democrats out of 32 teams. So yeah, the majority of them are very wealthy people, some of them very conservative socially, and this isn't the kind of issue they want to wrap their hands around. They want to stay away from it. I will say sort of generally that the locker rooms are kind of apolitical. And it may be just apolitical when the reporters are in the room, but I've very rarely been able to corner a player to talk openly about things that are considered political.
Because they're not allowed, literally, right? I mean, that's part of, having the shield on your chest is, if you speak out, this could happen to you, right?
Well, I don't know if it's allowed or not allowed. I have a feeling they know or self-censor because it's generally frowned upon. But we've pointed to Colin Kaepernick, but he was not alone. There were many other players who participated in the protest, including Doug Baldwin, who's still employed. Now, I don't know if Doug Baldwin, if he were a free agent, whether he would be picked up or not. But Colin Kaepernick has started this, and so his name is most closely attached to it. But, there are people like Doug Baldwin in locker rooms who will talk to you openly, but they really are the minority of out of the 53 players. You might find only a half dozen or so on any given day who might talk to you, as opposed to, say, an NBA locker room where it's almost the inverse, where most players will have an opinion, if not a fully formed opinion, and are generally willing to share it.
Yeah, I guess 50 years removed from Two Fists in the Sky and Muhammad Ali and the Olympics. I mean, we're still talking about these issues, and sports is still, very, very germane in this. I mean, if Kaepernick didn't take the knee, we wouldn't be talking about him right now. He'd be a backup quarterback in Buffalo or something, right?
Yeah, well, I don't know if he wants to be exiled there, but yeah, it's possible. But I think again, he's 29 years old, not even 30. He still has a lot of potential. We're in a point in the season where I think teams don't need to sign him yet. But like I said, once training camp starts, remember Teddy Bridgewater went down in preseason. Teams make big moves when they have to. And Colin Kaepernick has already said he's not going to be taking a knee for the national anthem if he plays again this year. So I think on the one hand, I think he's tried to present himself as having made his point and willing to move on from it. On the other hand, he's still very active on Twitter and is saying very political things on Twitter. So I'm not sure which one is the real Colin Kaepernick here.
He is Ken Belson. He covers all things NFL and sports in general for the New York Times, a little publication up there in New York. You can find him at L. Belson. That's EL_BELSON. And there's a lovely picture of a very bloodied Mr. Met on the front. And that was before he flipped off everybody with the middle. Was it the middle paw, the middle? I don't know what Mr. Met is. He just hugged me when I met him,
Middle digit, and I wonder if there's a free speech case to be made since he apparently has been laid off as well. But or at least the person imitating Mr. Met inside the uniform there.
We're all political here, and the Redskins have found themselves back into the news and back into you resharing and back into trying to protect the name that many Native Americans find offensive. Look, we've been using the Redskin term around here forever, mostly negatively because I'm from Baltimore and we hate the Redskins here, Ken. But, Daniel Snyder has, you talk about guys that have marched to their own beat for a decade and a half now as an owner. He doesn't really care who he pisses off. I mean, he has very little social graces when it comes to all this stuff, and he has a huge investment made in those markings and that brand, and he almost can't help but beating on his chest whenever he wins one of these little political battles, right?
Yeah, he said he was, quote, thrilled yesterday and hailed to the Redskins. He was unrepentant throughout, and I even produced some polls that suggested that some Native Americans were actually in support of the name. I had a very interesting interaction several years ago driving in Arizona, and it was up in Navajo country, and I passed a little roadside stand, and I got out to look at the silver jewelry that was there, and it was a fellow wearing a Redskins cap. and he was an American Indian. And I said, "Are you a Redskins fan?" And he said, "Yeah, why? Do you think because I'm an Indian?" And I said, "No, because you're in the middle of Arizona." And he said, "Well, my dad was in the Navy in Norfolk, Virginia, and so we just always rooted for them." And I said, "Well, don't you find the name offensive?" He said, "No, I don't necessarily feel that way." And then he pointed down the table at his mother, and he said, "That's my mom over there, and she's wearing a Cowboys hat." So,
I find that more offensive.
right. So I don't think it was a universally. I do agree that it has the connotations of a slur, but I don't think all Native Americans feel the same way about it. That's not to muddy the debate, but I think he owns the property, the intellectual property of the name, and he's not going to bend to anybody unless he has to. And you know what? Roger Goodell has basically stood by with him, and even said that he grew up a Redskins fan. So I don't think this was ever going to be a case where the NFL was going to change the name.
But there were a lot of colleges, a lot of universities, a lot of high schools that went for to Big Red or Little Red or Red something else or Red Storm, all that kind of stuff that's happened in the last 25 years. That a lot of people have acquiesced and just sort of gone the other way. Hey, the Indians have been in town all weekend, and I thought they did away with Chief Wahoo, and then I looked on their sleeve, and Chief Wahoo's back in Cleveland.
Yep. No, in fact, they've been singled out by the commissioner of Major League Baseball to consider trimming or scaling back Chief Wahoo. So there may be around the edges some movement by the leagues. But again, the NFL, as we pointed out in the Kaepernick case, is perhaps the least progressive of the major leagues. And so I think we're probably going to see action or movement the last or at the end compared to the other leagues. So maybe if the Indians change their name, they might follow suit. But I don't think that's happening anytime soon.
Ken, this whole thing's going to play out on the NFL field this year where they're going to be playing football in a soccer stadium in Carson. They're going to be playing a lame duck at least one season, maybe several, now in Oakland, given this Vegas thing. I'm from Baltimore, dude. I remember the last day the Oilers were here in '83. I remember the first day back in '96 when Vinny Testaverde brought the Purple Birds in here and, how much angst we went through as a community, but also how much all of us pitched in to buy a palace that Peter Angelo says meandered his way into here over the last quarter of a century and taken advantage of, and backed up a Brinks truck to the tune of $3 billion off of our people building him a baseball stadium. And the same could be said for the football stadium. But boy, this is going to be an ugly little scenario for the NFL over the next couple of years, for the Raiders fans, for the Chargers fans, for the Rams, for St. Louis, and for anybody else that's going to get involved in all of this. And I know Nevada apparently had no problem bending over and just charging you and me and anybody else that spends a hotel night out there money to bring the Raiders in. There's always going to be somebody to build a stadium, right?
Yeah, and that not to be too cynical, but the NFL and most of the other leagues know that. You can pit one city against another. And frankly, my hat goes off to the mayor of Oakland for standing on principle that she wasn't going to use taxpayer money, which, by the way, she claimed she didn't have anyway. So she wasn't going to mortgage a future or cut benefits currently so that a private enterprise like the NFL and the Raiders, which, by the way, are not going broke, would get a benefit. And she lost the bet, if you will, the gamble. But you know what? She stood on principle, and so far as I can tell, she's the first big city mayor to talk honestly and say that she really doesn't have the money. Now, of course, the NFL will believe that there always is money somewhere to be made, whether it's car rental taxes, hotel taxes, like you mentioned in Las Vegas. But you know what? She would be a hypocrite if she turned around and said, well, all right, we'll tax the tourists. Because you can also tax the tourists and use that money for education, for your roads, for any number of other things. It doesn't have to be for sports. So I feel bad for the Oakland Raider fans, but I do applaud her for standing on principle.
He is Ken Bilson. He does all things at the New York Times. You can follow him at L Belson. That's _BELSON out on Twitter. Last thing for you here. I want to stretch this out and give you an opportunity as a writer, and I know you retweeted Frank DeFord's death and had some comments about that as well. And obviously here in Baltimore, he was a local guy. And I guess anybody that's ever written a sports story or been around this over the last 40 years, we all owe some debt of gratitude to people like Frank DeFord.
Yeah, he's amazing. I loved listening to him on NPR, and of course, remember reading him growing up in SI. I was struck by a excerpt from his memoir that was in Sports Illustrated a few weeks back after he died, and he talked about the good old days in the '60s and '70s when sports writers, newspaper in particular, kind of ruled the roost. But he talked about how television changed the dynamic and how the Howard Cosell's of the world brought sports more immediately into homes, and national TV contracts changed the dynamic and the way we got sports, and how that forced newspaper writers to change themselves, because most people had watched Monday Night Football, didn't need to read the newspaper the next day to find the result, and so they changed. And of course, that's changing yet again now because the web is changing everything, and people are watching cable TV. They're not just watching Game of the Week. So I think it's an interesting. He hit on something without, I think, fully understanding what he was hitting on there. But it was really interesting to see how he was at the cusp of that change and how he changed himself and ended up being a very extraordinary radio personality as well.
Ken, always a pleasure to check in with you, and we don't do it often enough, but I do appreciate your time anytime you make some time here. Have a great summer. We'll see you at an NFL stadium nearby, I'm sure, soon.
Very good. Thanks, Nestor.
You got it. Ken Belson joining us here from the New York Times. He is that's EL_BELSON. If you want to follow him out on Twitter, a great follow who shares a lot of great writing as well at the New York Times. You can find me out in the Buy a Toyota Audio Vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. We do come in crystal clear from anywhere in the world you happen to be. Digitally, we deliver our morning newspaper to your email inbox at 7 a.m. each and every morning. It's all powered up by Planet Fitness and planetfitness.com. I have written a book this summer. Actually, I wrote it 4 years ago about Peter Angelo. It's called The Peter Principles. Chapter 6 was released this week out at WNST.net. Chapter 7 comes early next week as well. I'll be releasing a chapter a week all summer long so that if you're not struggling with the Oriole pitching, you could at least learn some of the history of Oriole baseball and ownership here in Baltimore. It is The Peter Principles, also hashtagged out on our social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.